Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 337 of the Chronological Read Through the Bible. Today's reading picks up in Acts chapter 21, verse 37 through Acts chapter 23. And I'm going to be primarily looking at Acts chapter 23 today for my commentary. So, Paul has been arrested as it was prophesied. So it comes as no surprise to Paul. So he is scooped up and held captive. So at this point, he's in chains. They've even threatened to beat him, at which point he has said, you will flog a Roman citizen? Well, this now brings great attention to his captors, the Roman guard, because a Roman citizen had so many more rights than the average person of the day. And really, just for him to have been arrested the way he was not acceptable behavior at that time for the Roman soldiers to have done. But he's been arrested. He's brought before the Sanhedrin, the ruling council in Jerusalem. And remember, the Sanhedrin basically means 70. So it's the 70 elders. What we're going to see is you read through this passage, you'll see that Paul even addresses the council quite different than how we saw Peter address the Sanhedrin, even from how we saw Stephen address the Sanhedrin. Right out the gate in verse 1, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my whole life with a peaceable, good conscience before God to this day." So a perfectly good conscience to that day he's lived. And what did he call them? He just referred to them as brethren. When we look at how Peter and Stephen addressed the Sanhedrin, they all addressed them really with a deep respect, elders. And so they had this respect. I'm not saying that Paul doesn't, but I think that it's that Paul, when he was Saul, was on equal footing. I don't know that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. We're never given that, but I think that he saw himself as one of those leaders at one point. And so he is reminding them, you know me. I'm no foreigner to you. And now he begins to address those there. So let me just read these first few verses because I want to get to a part of my point here that oftentimes I think some commentators take this in a different direction, and I'm going to just highlight something here. I think I've even addressed this way back in some of my older videos. I touched on this a little bit when Jesus was before the group of elders, before the Sanhedrin. The high priest, Ananias, commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit and try to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? But the bystanders said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. I think there's a few things going on here. I'm going to say right off the bat, a lot of commentators will say that Paul had poor eyesight. This is addressed in two different occasions in his letter to the church in Galatia. He mentions having poor eyesight. Even says, look at how bold letters or how big I write. And some translations will say, look at this big letter that I've written you. Well, that I don't think would be the case because Galatians isn't that big of a letter. It's not as large as some of his others. So I think that was a mistranslation. Other translations tend to say, look at what bold letters I write with here, or how large I've written this. So I'm not saying that it's not an eyesight problem. Could have been, but I tend to think that there's something else that's taking place here. And what I believe is occurring is he's pointing out the fact that Ananias is not truly the high priest, not by order of true succession of the high priesthood. He is just a puppet. He's been appointed there as had the high priest for the past several years. So I think that that's a part of what's taking place. I think there's also the reminder that Jesus now is the high priest. So there's many different ways that you can look at this. Yet Paul, I think, does catch himself also. So as I say, I think this is one of these complex, a lot of different things that are taking place. This isn't checkers. This isn't chess. This is more like 3D chess. This is a big game that's taking place here. And yet God's in control of what's happening. So Paul does come back, and he's the appointed one, so okay. But what the high priest is doing is not proper. It's not proper for him to command these men to strike the accused. Think of how out of place that would be. And Paul should be given his right to speak. As he's standing among the Sanhedrin, these again are his own people. This is where he came from. These are his roots, if you will. Paul has said that he came from a family of Pharisees, and he's going to be quite strategic in pitting the Pharisees and the Sadducees against one another in this by mentioning the resurrection of Christ and saying that's what this is all about. You're all upset, and all of a sudden the Pharisees and the Sadducees are going to go at it with each other. And it tells us that fearing that Paul's basically going to be ripped apart by these two groups, the soldiers come in and remove him from them. Paul knows just what buttons to push. And it comes back to, as I say, when Paul's even addressing the issue with the high priest, I think that is why that's a strategic statement that he makes, because he knows just what to say to this particular audience, because these are, for all purposes, these are his people. This is where he came from. And we see a part of this in something that may be easily overlooked in a way. And this is when we get to verse 16. It says, "But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush." This is when this group of men from the council have conspired to murder Paul. So it tells us there were more than 40 who formed this plot. And they say, well, we're not going to eat anything. We're going to fast until we have been able to kill him. I think at some point they probably broke that little pledge that they had made. So what I wanted you to catch, though, is, but the son of Paul's sister. So this is his nephew. This is the one and only time that we hear of any of Paul's family mentioned. And were they believers? What were they doing in Jerusalem? Was the nephew attending one of the many religious schools there? Was he in training to be a rabbi? There's many unanswered questions at which this side of heaven we will never know the answer to. But it's really interesting to see how that unfolds. So when the nephew informs Paul of this, Paul, now having declared his Roman citizenship, he can order, I shouldn't say order, but he can tell the guards there that certain things need to be done. And so the nephew is then taken to the one who's in charge of the Roman guards. So there's a lot taking place here. There's the battle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I want you to realize there were three main groups in Jerusalem at the time, and again, this comes into play as far as where I see the Judaizers falling also into this. Now, the Judaizers were most likely, we don't know really whether they were Pharisees or Sadducees, maybe a mixture of the two. But we had the Pharisees who believed in a resurrection. They believed in a spiritual life. They even accepted angels. The Sadducees, we oftentimes know that they did not believe in the resurrection, and that's how Paul got them worked up. But they didn't believe in the Spirit or even angels. They didn't really accept a spiritual world at the time. For all better purposes, they were your liberal body of that day. They were just Jews in name only. They were sort of, if you will, you have the Orthodox Jews today, you have the Reformed Jews, and then you have the Reformed Church. And so the Orthodox, the conservative, and the Reform. And so the Sadducees would be more of your Reform Jews. The Pharisees would be more of the conservative, and the Essenes that lived in the Dead Sea region where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. They're the ones that wrote the scrolls, that put them in the earthen jars and hid them away. They would be your Orthodox of today. So if you understand some of the Jewish settings of today, and I'm not saying that that's actually those groups, I'm just saying that would be comparable to what they're like. The Essenes, we don't see them on the scene at all with this. They are so far outside of what's happening within this realm because they are a reclusive group. Some would say, well, what happened to them? Well, they really died out because they were almost like a real reclusive group and almost more of monks in that sense. Most of them did not get married, so that's pretty much what happened to them. They just vanished. They died out. The Judaizers, I think, were trying to get the Christians to come in, but not. They were going to have to give up a lot of the teachings of Christ to then be accepted in that setting. And that wasn't going to happen. So Paul's been encountered with these difficulties, and the Lord comes to him to tell him that everything's going to be okay and that he will take him to Rome, that he will end up testifying of Jesus in Rome. And that's what Paul was hoping for. I wouldn't say that he was hoping to be arrested to then be taken to Rome, but I think he knew that the events would unfold at God's will. And that's really something we need to realize, that despite all that's happening here, Paul's at peace, really. And even when I think he begins to I wouldn't say doubt, but begins to have some difficulty just within himself about what's taking place. Realize the very prison that he's been put in is the same prison that an angel came and released Peter from. But that doesn't happen with Paul. And I think that that's a part of then Jesus coming to comfort Paul and to let Paul know that this is all going to work out according to God's plan. And so will it in your life. We only need to trust him and follow him. Well, brothers and sisters, I hope I added just a little bit to this passage today for you. And as I say, we don't know the exact reason for his statement of, well, I didn't know that this was the high priest. I tend, for me personally, to lean on the fact that this man really is not legitimately the high priest. And at that point, Jesus now was the high priest for the nation. He is our priest. And so as we see that laid out in the book of Hebrews. Well, brothers and sisters, I do hope and pray that your day's going well. Until tomorrow, God bless.